Hello, I'm Shankar.
And I'm Nikhil. This is Chai Across Generations. This is episode 31, talking about Jaahnavi Kandula, the American Dream Unfulfilled.
In this episode, we want to address a news story relevant to our community that has been gathering a lot of attention in the media. This topic concerns a violent incident involving law enforcement, so if you're listening with kids, we recommend reviewing this episode before sharing it with them.
Yeah, Shankar, we saw this come across our timelines in the last few days, and I think we just decided we needed to do an episode on this. And we'll talk about how this ties or doesn't tie to the American Dream after we've covered the news story. So let me lay out some of the basics, and then we can chat about it. So Jaahnavi Kandula is a 23-year-old from Andhra Pradesh. She was studying at Northeastern University in the Seattle area, getting a master's in information systems. And on January 23rd of this year, she was running in a crosswalk when she was unfortunately and tragically hit by Officer Kevin Austin Dave. He was going 74 miles per hour in a 25 mile per hour zone. And some of the reports that you and I saw had that she was thrown more than 100 feet on impact. She died, unfortunately, and she was a grad student months away from graduating. I think the reason this became a news story is because in recent days, earlier this week, body cam footage was released of another officer, Daniel Otterer, who is a part of the Seattle Police Officers Guild, and he's the vice president there. And it's him talking about the incident to one of his superiors. And in it, he says a number of statements, and you can find the video online if you're interested. But in describing this incident with Jaahnvi, he says, "No, it's a regular person." He says, "Yeah, just write a check." And he says, $11,000. She was 26 anyway. She had limited value. In his defense, he says he was speaking to his superior about what lawyers might say about this incident. But as you can imagine, and this is at least how it landed on me too, this idea of her having limited value, of her being worth some amount of money, some low amount of money like $11,000, has really struck a chord in the community. So I'm not sure what else to say about this, to be honest with you, but those are kind of the basics of the situation. What are you thinking or feeling?
Yeah, Nikhil, thanks for sharing that story with me. And just to, as you know, you're the one who came across it first and you passed it on and I read it. And of course, it was really saddening, very tragic. And statements that I watched the video as well. Of course, the officer who made those statements is defending himself, but one also tries to piece together the non-verbal, non-spoken affect of the voice, the laughter, and things like that, and you form a more complete story as to the veracity of that person's statement. And to be quite honest, it doesn't add up. I mean, you don't laugh in that sort of a dismissive fashion when you're talking about someone else. But I'll let the speech experts and the behavioral experts weigh in on that. But it's just as a layman, it just doesn't add up. And unfortunately, it is very consistent for the disregard for a human life, which we see all too often, both in the United States and abroad. It reminded me of the case of Srinivas Kuchibhotla not so long ago. Maybe I don't know how many years back, but he was, I believe, in Olathe, Kansas, and he was mistaken for an Iranian by a retired Navy serviceman who did not want Iranian foreigners in this country, and he shot him to death. And you know, in that case, also, it was the sheer ignorance of an American in that case, of just how the world lives, the different ways that people live, um, a complete ignorance of being able to distinguish between different countries, nationalities. Not I'm not saying that that should make a case to disrespect any human life, but it really speaks to that ignorance, and I think it's the same ignorance that's at play in this sort of offhand, flippant statement that we saw in the case of Jaahnavi Kandula by the officer who was caught on the body cam. And I think, to me, having lived so many years in the United States, we cannot ignore the larger backdrop of unequal respect for human life that I see in the US. America has a peculiar feature called exceptionalism, which is that Americans are exceptional and the world is different. And the growth of this starts first with the way we treat immigrants, who, until they become citizens, are considered, aliens, as we've talked about in the immigration episode. When you alienate someone from your definition of a human being, it makes it easier to mistreat them. This is a standard theory of how genocide starts. Um, and you can see it in the rhetoric of several demagogues, who, when they want to foment public anger against any figure, they will immediately strip them of their humanity. And it's also true when we see the coverage of wars in which the United States is involved abroad, that we very rarely see the report of human casualties of the other nationality, but we only see US troop
Mm,
casualties. We very rarely see live coverage of what they call collateral damage, civilian deaths caused by US occupation, caused by US involvement. And that has to change, in my opinion. I mean, it is unconscionable for a country to talk about high moral ground and all these values of, the founding fathers, and continue on a daily basis to behave like that, both with people who don't live in the United States and also people who live here, which is the case here, right? So to me, that's what is shocking. And it's the larger backdrop, as I said, unequal respect for human life in the US is reflected by the egregious level of police brutality against blacks. We saw that, highlighted in the George Floyd case. But if you're like me and you follow some of these things, it's George Floyd is just one in a long list of names. It's shameful that I should be able to remember so many of these names. In a sense, there shouldn't be so many such cases, but it's not one. And I'm hoping that through this episode, we will be able to shine a light on that, and inspire our listeners to do some small part as Americans, or as people who are living in this country, or even if they're not living in this country, maybe they can shine a light on it in other forum and media, and acknowledge that there are people who live here who would like things to be better. I mean, what
hmm
happened to this young lady was unconscionable and tragic, undoubtedly, but the response to it was even worse, is what I would say.
Right.
Right? Accidents may happen, but I think we need to behave in a more humane fashion.
Yeah. I think that's very well said, Shankar. Similar to you, my initial reaction was one of sadness and anger at those statements, right? Like you said, sometimes accidents happen, sometimes tragic accidents happen, and that's so unfortunate. But this language that was captured, she had limited value. Her life was worth $11,000. Where is that even coming from? And I want to, as you were saying, place this appropriately in the context of the treatment that African Americans experience with the police, as you mentioned, George Floyd, another instance, and the rate at which they are in contact with the police or hurt by police is much higher than what we experience in the South Asian community. So I think we have to acknowledge that. And also note that there are cases where South Asians have been not treated well by police.
Mhm.
This case comes to mind with Jaahnavi Kandula. You mentioned another case earlier. There's also the case of a man in Texas I remember seeing last year, an Indian man in Texas around my age, I think early 30s, who was coming home to his place but had forgotten his key. And so he went to the front and was trying to look for his key. An officer mistook him as someone trying to break in and shot him, and he died. So there are some instances like that. I think it's important. One of the reasons we wanted to do this, right, is to acknowledge, to honor Jaahnavi's life, to give voice to some of these instances that have come up in our community, and to also appropriately place it as something that happens in our community or has happened in our community, but also acknowledging that other groups also experience discrimination and poor treatment by police. And in some cases, there is a longer history of that and a more intense, kind of tragic history of that.
Mhm. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. Yeah, I mean, uh, until we get past the notion of guilty until proven innocent,
Mm,
right?
yeah.
As opposed to innocent until proven guilty, this is going to dog us. And the question of how law enforcement reform is needed is a much bigger question, which we are probably not going to get into in this episode. But we'd like to, I think, focus a little bit more on the other piece of our episode title, which is really about the American dream. We talked about this, and it struck me that what does this mean for that part? Do you want to share a little bit about what you think, how we should steer this?
Yeah. So when I think about the American dream, think about the idea of equal opportunity, equal treatment, freedom to be oneself, and there are certainly upsides for the American dream. There are people who come from immigrant backgrounds and make it big here in America. But I also think we have to acknowledge it's often romanticized and idealized. And even in the incident we talked about in this episode, sometimes it goes unfulfilled. Um, and we have to, I think, reckon with that as well, in ways where it doesn't quite hold and what that means for all of us. I'm curious to hear from you, Shankar, how you think about the American dream and how you maybe made sense of it, because you were actually making the decision to immigrate here, right? In a way where I was a young passenger and wasn't actively making that choice.
Yeah, that's right. Well, thanks for sharing that. And as you mentioned, the um, thread that really struck me was what were Jaahnavi's dreams?
Mm-hmm.
And to the extent that her dreams were not fulfilled, what does it mean for our collective American dream? How many such dreams can be sacrificed in order for the others to realize there? Or do they need to be sacrificed, right? Or should the fact that these dreams should not be sacrificed be a part of a larger dream, right?
Right.
So when I came to this country, the American dream, as I heard it was narrated to me by my friends here, was, the house with a white picket fence, two-car garage, dogs, whatnot, right? To be honest, I did not identify with that.
Mm.
Um, One, I've lived in academic spaces a lot, so uh, tend to be a bit nonconformist in that sense. And the people I interacted with who are Americans were also very nonconformist,
Mm.
and so they would sort of talk about this tongue in cheek. Um, but the Asian American dream, and I here particularly, I should say probably Indian American dream, but probably applies to all Asians, as I've seen it play out in many Indian immigrant stories. It's a home in suburbia, the family van, generating generational wealth, and making sure the kids go to a highly ranked school that leads to a lucrative career, right? And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think it's a beautiful thing that people are able to achieve this. But I think if we achieve that in a society that allows something like Jaahnavi Kandula or a Philando Castile or a Amadou Diallo or a Trayvon Martin or a George Floyd, what does it mean? Are we living two different? Are we living in? Do we want two different societies? One where success is sort of enabled in a stratum of society and extreme violence is okay on the other part. So, what about social justice for the oppressed? The common cause that racial prejudice and racial injustice engenders when we see and hear about these incidents. Don't we feel that something like this that is happening has a common thread? And should it not unite us that whoever is oppressed, regardless of their race, right, is, that's not fair. And that there has to be some redress and that part of our success would not be possible, without sort of the right circumstances, and then the denial of those circumstances. So it's a question of, I would say, it's privilege. We are privileged to enjoy that success, and acknowledging that not everyone has that same privilege. So when you talked about equality, equal opportunity, equal treatment, then to be aware of that, and having been privileged to enjoy that success, to then think about social justice for those who do not have that privilege, right, or who are denied
Right.
that in very violent ways. And really, I mean, I think, to me, when we talk about the American dream, the thing that resonates to me with me is Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech. To me, that
Mm-hmm.
was an American dream too, right?
Yeah.
And I think it'll be good for us to also reflect on that and think of that as part of our Indo-American heritage,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm. You
And so,
mean
what are your
even
thoughts on that?
you mean even
Hmm?
Martin Luther King's speech?
Absolutely, because he was deeply influenced by Gandhi,
Right. Yeah.
and he, in fact, I believe he went to India and visited and
Mm.
met Gandhi.
Mm.
And so, then how is it that we now cannot, in turn, benefit from his vision?
Right. Great point.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah. I like everything you said. You know, I had this thought. I had this thought as you were speaking about where does this all fall apart, right? When we talk about the American dream and we talk about Jaahnavi Kandula and what happened to her and other incidents. And I actually think oftentimes we end up in one of two extremes almost, right? When
Mhm.
you look at an incident like Jaahnavi Kandula and you think there's one group that might say, hey, be grateful. Be grateful that you're here. Don't worry about it. Accidents happen, mistakes happen, move on.
Right. Right.
There's the other extreme that says, kind of is like, we can't do anything until this injustice is rectified,
Mhm.
right? Like none of it
Mhm.
matters, none of the other opportunity matters until some of these awful incidents are dealt with and folks are brought to justice.
Mhm.
And I really think maybe the balance is in finding a compassionate way to be in the middle,
Mhm.
to say immense gratitude for what this country has to offer, right?
Mhm.
In terms of opportunity, in terms of, like you said, the ability to raise your family and really create generational wealth and all of this stuff and live in a
Right.
more even society.
Right.
And at the same time, recognizing we're not there.
Right.
We're not there, and we should continue to strive to get there. To be honest with you, will we ever get there? I'm not sure.
Mhm.
But we have to acknowledge where we fall short. We have to speak up, I think, when we fall short in order
Mhm.
to push toward that dream, toward Martin Luther King's dream, right?
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
but I think oftentimes it can be one or the other, right? Either be more grateful or be more, not even ungrateful, but more demanding, maybe. Like we can't appreciate any of it until we have addressed all
Right.
of it.
Right. I agree. Yeah. Uh, And the way I kind of see it is that when we look at a lot of Indian immigrants, particularly those who came after the 60s, right, we actually came with a lot of intellectual capital, um, familial social capital,
Mm-hmm.
and other kinds of capital, cultural capital, right? And I think we're not leveraging that for the greater good as much as we could by standing apart from society and community that we live in,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I agree with you. I'm not saying that, look, this is a fantastic opportunity to be in a land where, there is still so much of the natural environment that's preserved compared to many parts of the world, where there is still education and opportunity and a high level of comfort and all those things, right? That allow us to sort of to blossom as our selves to their fullness of their potential and all that, right?
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, I think we have to acknowledge that it's a position of a high privilege. And with privilege comes, there's an old word, it's called noblesse oblige. It was
Mm,
applied to the, to the monarchy and the wealthy in the old days, right? And it's sort of that kind of privilege requires you to be humble and care about everyone.
mm.
And I think we've forgotten that.
Yeah, I think you're right. And what you mentioned about what were Jaahnavi's dreams, right?
Mhm.
Like this is a news story. You could say the inciting incident of all this is the comments by the second officer and how that has created a lot of awareness or publicity around this. But the core of this is her life. The core of this
Mhm.
is the person she wanted to be. What did she want to do after she graduated? And she was supporting her mother back home. What were her family's goals and aspirations for her? It's like you said, when you think about it on a human level, and
Right,
just a 23-year-old passing away
right.
tragically, it's in some ways it feels like that's all that really matters in that instant, right? To
A-
extend some compassion and understanding there.
Absolutely. I'm with you on that. I don't think this is so much about justice in any sense, in my, at least in my mind. Like, I'm speaking just for myself. Maybe it is for other people, and that's they're entitled to their viewpoint. But when I talk about this, is not about bringing that officer to justice as much uh, as honoring the fact that those dreams shouldn't go on, or we should do our best to make sure that those dreams don't go unfulfilled. And the reason I say that is because I think if we look at it from the lens of law enforcement, they have a very difficult job. We also have to acknowledge that. This is a country where there is a very large number of guns. There are more guns than people in this country. And so that makes the law enforcement job very, very difficult. When they enter into any dangerous situation, they probably have a greater reason to fear for their lives than if they were enforcing the law in any other part of the world. And I'm sympathetic to that. It's also true that when you're constantly exposed to high levels of violence, you will get desensitized to
Mm,
it, is also a fact.
right.
And so, you know, it's not so much about taking a higher moral ground or anything like that. It is just sad that we have also made our law enforcement suffer to the point where they're behaving like this
Mm,
in some sense, right? So it requires action on many different fronts, and probably a lot of support and reform for them, but also support for them in different ways. And
yeah.
yeah, so I'm not trying to be unsympathetic to the other side of the situation here,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, and I would say in my mind it is about justice. I hope
Mm-hmm.
that she and her family get justice. What that
Mm-hmm.
means specifically for the officer, I'm not sure. I also don't
Right.
have all of the facts in front of me, but I hope, however this plays out, I hope justice is served. I would encourage all of us to try to tap into that consideration for others a little bit more, right? And that was
Yep.
kind of our hope in doing this episode was let's bring this up. This is certainly not the typical vein of episode that we do.
Yeah.
Um, but to be able to say, let's take a moment, let's think about what's happened here. Let's try to think about this person's experience and what this might tell us about the state of the American dream.
Right.
And I hope we all take a moment to reflect on this, to read up on it. Her family did have a GoFundMe account months ago. It seems like
Mm-hmm.
that has been taken down. Otherwise, I think we would link that. But maybe there are other ways that we can help. Part of it in discussion with others, but part of it just in reflection on our own, right? To
Mm-hmm.
think about, like you said, to not forget about other people in the pursuit of the American dream, but to
Right.
realize we kind of have to look out for one another. Um, and not just within our community, just as humans.
Right. Right. No, I thanks, Nikhil. I know you were very moved by this, which is why we decided to jump in and do this episode, and I honor that. And you're right. We live in a community, and we live in several communities at once. And I agree with you that we can't ignore it. Um, the purpose of law enforcement, the mission technically is to serve and to protect. And it really is hard to believe that someone who says things like that is anywhere close to the mission of serving and protecting.
Mm.
Those are not the words of someone who's there to serve and protect, in my opinion. Right. And so I think accountability is important, right? Probably that resonates with your idea of, justice in whatever form it is, right? But accountability, and I think holding our public servants accountable is an important part of functioning in a civil society. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's something about the fact that she was so young too.
Hmm.
And at some point, when you see things happen to folks younger than you, that has a unique effect on me
Yeah.
at least, right? Where before it was folks who were older than me, and now it's folks who are younger than me. There's some layer of sadness or protective instinct or something that is coming through in that. But yeah, I'm grateful that you brought up and kind of tied this back into how do we think about the American dream and our pursuit of it and
Mhm.
acknowledging when it's unfulfilled, how it's unfulfilled. Because we shouldn't just rest on our laurels and say we're in America and things are good and it's all gravy.
Mhm.
Um, because we really do have to consider others, and that's what I'm taking away from this conversation and hearing you speak is it's about expanding our hopefully our awareness, our consciousness to the welfare of more people around us, not
Mhm.
in the singular pursuit of the American dream.
Yeah, and to give you some really positive stuff that I've been observing is that the way the American dream has been working, as I see it, is that your generation and Indo Americans who are younger than you, many of them are deeply interested in participating in the legal field on the part of immigration or engaged in criminal justice reform and really, sensitized to this idea of social justice. Perhaps even I would hazard a lot more than my generation.
Mm,
That's what I've
yeah.
observed. Anecdotal, I don't think I have statistics to back it up, but every time I talk to someone who's from your generation younger, um, I see them to be uh, a lot more, you know, animated about these things and actually engaging in them as their career path. And to me, that is then the fulfillment of the American dream.
Mm,
The very fact that in one generation we have transformed our, you may say, ideals and stuff to encompass that is a
yeah.
victory for the American dream.
Right. Yeah, and I just want to say it's so inspiring to be in conversation with you about this as someone in a different generation, as someone from a generation that might not typically speak about this or think about this as much as the generations that come after or that have come after. So I'd like to hold you up as an inspiration in that regard, Shankar, to create that space, right? And to have this conversation with me. And I hope in our community we can have this conversation across generations, right? Whether it's this story or stories, other stories, but there's something to be learned and gained, right, on either side of this.
Thanks, Nikhil. I think compassion doesn't know generations.
Yeah. Well, I think there's, there's an awareness and an action. I think if more people were aware
Right,
of some of the dynamics you and I have been talking about,
right.
certainly I think that would be a rallying cry. But you have taken the time and the effort to think about these things, to sit with these things, to consider, our community's experience and the African American community's experience, and to engage with it. So that type of proactivity maybe is what I want to
Yeah,
highlight, and I think we can all continue to learn that as we grow, right? Not to write anyone off on that.
that's a very good point. It's really about raising awareness. So a lot of people are just not aware of the history of many of these things, the history of underrepresented minorities and communities in the US. In fact, I came across this really interesting thing called the Zin Project. I don't know if you've looked at this
Mm.
page. It's a really fantastic resource. It's like this historical record of various events that happened in US history. And, to be, to give my generation a break, we don't study the same kind of history, and particularly US history, in that depth when we're in India or from, other parts of the world. And I guess for me, as I told you, it was the music that led me to it. So I loved the
Hmm.
blues. So I wanted to learn about the story of the people who created this music and their history and their trials and their tribulations. And it's that thing that led me, gave me that window to read about it and get excited about it and form friendships in the community. It's been very eye opening to me.
Hmm.
And I think my understanding of US history is very shaped by that. And so you're right. But if people were made aware of it, I'm sure their hearts would open and they would see things in
Yeah.
a richer light. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Well, here's to hoping that this episode maybe finds some people and raises some awareness, right, around some of these challenges, dynamics, around the American dream and how we can hopefully continue to work toward a better community and society for all. Yeah. Any closing thoughts?
Yeah. Just wishing peace for both, for all of Janvi's family, and hoping that we treated this with the due respect and sensitivity that it deserves, and that it'll be an inspiration for all our listeners to think more deeply about these topics, expand their awareness, open their hearts with compassion, and see how best to move forward, both individually and as a community and as a member of all the communities that compose our American citizenry here and world citizenry at some level,
Right.
right? Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks, Shankar. And to our listeners, if this is on your hearts and minds, I hope this is an outlet to consider, this incident, to process it, maybe even to use this as a way to have conversations around it with other folks in our community, beyond our community, and across generations. I found that healing with you here, Shankar. So I want to thank you again. And Shankar, how can our listeners find us?
You can always reach out to us on our Instagram page, Chai Across Generations, or our email at chaiacrossgenerations@gmail.com.
Perfect. And as always, you can subscribe to our podcast and please leave us a rating or review on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. This really, really helps new people find our show. And we want to thank you all for listening.
So until next time, enjoy your chai and your conversations, and we'll see you all in a week.
Bye.